Hello, my name is Crystal Petry, and you are watching another episode of the Crystal Petry Podcast, Season 3. Leadership isn't just about control or command. It's about presence, awareness, and how we show up as humans. In this episode, we explore leadership through the lens of emotional intelligence and Zen Buddhist principles, unpacking how mindfulness, compassion, and self awareness can transform the way we lead. This is a conversation for leaders ready to slow down, look inward, and lead with clarity and purpose. Welcome to the podcast, Miss Cara Fox. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you so much for being on this podcast and stepping into this topic. So, Miss Cara, where in the world are you?
I am located in Anchorage, Alaska.
You know, I was thinking about this. I think you are my you're my second podcast guest from Alaska. My second one. My first one is who referred you? Rao.
Yes, I was going to say, I think I know your first one.
My first one is Rao. She referred you. So excited. So let's dive into this podcast. How do you define leadership when it's rooted in humanity rather than hierarchy? Because when most people think of leadership, they think hierarchy.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question to start out, because the way that when I refer to leaders and when I talk about leadership, I don't limit it to titles or hierarchy or position. I really believe that effective trust-based leadership doesn't require that. It doesn't depend on titles, or it doesn't depend on having given authority. Leadership to me is really about influencing, inspiring, and guiding other people with vision, purpose, and care. And I think those are things that, we can all care for one another, of course, but when you add in vision and purpose and inspiration, those things are what make a leader. And I think that you can do that from anywhere you sit. If you have a high degree of self-mastery, you effectively manage your relationships, you have credibility, and you lift other people up wherever and whenever you can. It comes through in acts of courage. I think particularly in this day and age, in this reality that we're living in, that's especially important. Practicing integrity and honesty, and building a culture of belonging, inclusion, equity, and justice. I think all of those things take courage and really can be seen as acts of leadership. And by doing that, it also, like when we talk about actual business results and business processes, a leader is someone who innovates, who challenges the status quo, and isn't afraid to do that, isn't afraid to maybe get it wrong, but is willing to step out and try something different, or question, why are we doing it this way? Is it because we've always done it this way, or is there some other reason? And someone who can align values with goals and purpose and mission, and kind of be really solid on all of those.
What about presence? What does presence mean in leadership? And why does it, and this is me, why does it seem to be so hard to be present?
It's not just you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that.
And this is why I focus on this in my practice and in my approach to leadership, is that, so first of all, presence to me is mindfulness and focus. And let me just describe kind of what that can look like. So being fully present and there for a conversation with somebody. And we all know what that looks like when it's not happening, right? You have your phone in front of you and you're trying to talk and type at the same time. Or it's your keyboard, or, whatever. We're in a society that values multitasking. And I think we're being asked to multitask, or being coached to multitask more and more in order to increase productivity. And it does exactly the opposite. So being fully present, it means that you're focused, you're not distracted, you're not trying to do 5 things at once. You're doing what I call unitasking instead of multitasking. So you're able to bring, you're able to bring your full abilities and focus to that thing, whatever it is, if it's a person you're talking to or a project you're working on. And that actually makes you more effective, because when we multitask, when we spread our focus and our presence amongst different things, and it could also be just that our mind is somewhere else. I mean, we've all been in that situation where you've been reading something and you read a paragraph like 3 times and you still don't know what it says.
Yes.
Because your mind is somewhere else. So we end up wasting a lot of time and effort and energy because we're trying to do so many things at once. So presence is really about deciding intentionally to be there for that one thing. Mm-hmm. And it's difficult because we live in what's been called an attention economy. I don't know if you've heard that term.
I have not.
So the idea is that we live in an age where companies, particularly in social media, but it's true everywhere, companies are spending millions of dollars studying how to grab and keep our attention. And they know what they're doing. Like it is hard to resist, right? Mm-hmm. We have all these colorful apps on our phones. And it's, doom scrolling is a thing for a reason. And we've been biologically infiltrated, I guess you could say, by these companies that are designing things. And I'm not saying they're evil or anything like that. It's just, everybody's vying for our attention.
Right.
And so there's actually been research done, and I forget the exact study, but where they've been tracking human attention spans on average, and they are decreasing. Like,
yes,
they're literally getting smaller.
Yes,
so
I've read that
when you
too.
say it's hard, it really is harder. And I think that's because we have more distractions everywhere. We have access to so many things and to so much data and to so many shiny objects. And people are being asked to do more, while at the same time, companies are laying people off. They're holding back on hiring. They're being wooed with the magic of AI is going to 10x everybody's productivity. I think there's a lot of hype around that. I think there's some real amazing things we can do with AI, but at the same time, the way that it's being approached is pressuring people to feel like, oh my gosh, I have to do more with less. Otherwise, I'm not going to have a job anymore. And so we feel like we have to make the most of every single minute. I was reading a time management book the other day, and it was like, schedule your entire day down to the minute,
Oh, wow.
Oh my gosh. Like, I know.
Who has time to do that?
Well, right. But also, like, what about just having those moments that aren't planned?
Yes.
And conversations that aren't planned,
yes.
And time to just like let our brains decompress a little bit. Right. And they say to actually schedule that too, but so I think it goes a little far, and that's not unusual. So I think that's part of what's contributing to this difficulty in being present and focused. Our brains are overloaded, to put it very simply. And in this current day and age, we spend very little time devoted to just thinking or doing nothing. And I will admit, I find it hard to just sit and do nothing because I feel like I have to be doing something. And for me, I started a meditation practice, and I don't meditate for hours on end. I just don't. But 10 minutes a day was a real challenge at first. And now I find it very calming, and it's a real lovely time for me. But I am not a person that's naturally inclined to that. So yes. I think that we can train ourselves to it, but it is hard because of all those pressures around us.
In Zen Buddhism, awareness is foundational. Mm-hmm. How does awareness show up in effective leadership?
So in the framework or the approach that I use, we start with awareness. We start with self-awareness. And that is a core part of what I call the inner foundation. So when we approach leadership, starting sort of looking at yourself first, because you can't effectively lead others, in my opinion, without first looking in the mirror. And what this involves is things like knowing your strengths, knowing your natural tendencies, what are your priorities, your motivators, your stressors, being aware of your cognitive biases, because we all have them, your automatic thoughts that are maybe holding you back, and acknowledging the stories that you tell yourself. I think this is a really big one people often overlook. Human beings are wired by stories, and we all have our narratives of sort of the path we got to where we are today. And what's really interesting is if you take a look at those narratives and really examine, like, is that true? Or is that just what I've been telling myself?
Right.
And how do I need to reframe that in order to give myself more power or more confidence or more whatever it is, right? And is my story holding me back? So I think there's some real interesting things you can find out there. And then we also work heavily on noticing and identifying emotions, particularly when we're triggered. So self-awareness is largely about knowing what's going on internally at any given moment, and what's driving those behaviors that then follow those emotions. And then last but not least, knowing your own value, and knowing your values, and also your purpose. So all of those things kind of give you a starting point, a foundation to then lead others from a more solid place, and from a place of consistency, and knowing how to avoid being triggered, and knowing how you can also then relate to other people. So,
and I think a major part of what you're saying, Cara, is you got to figure out what your triggers are first before you can get to the self-awareness, the emotional part. What triggers you?
Yes.
So that part is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Knowing that about yourself is important. I think it's really easy to just say, oh yeah, I know what makes me angry, or I know what, gets under my skin. But sometimes those surface things aren't what's really bothering you,
Correct. Correct.
So really digging in and doing some of that hard work of truly knowing yourself. It's challenging, and it takes time, and it takes concerted effort. So yeah. And once you do those things, then you can apply your strengths proactively. So it's like, if I know what it is I bring to the table, I can be really proactive about using that for good, using that to support others. And then it also increases my own engagement and satisfaction. So it's like a win all around. And you can be proactive about making sure your priorities and needs are addressed, and have a better handle on how you interact with other people, so that you're not acting out of triggered responses. Yeah.
How can leaders lead without ego, but still have authority? Sometimes I feel like it goes hand in hand, the ego and authority.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I will say we all have egos. So I don't think that ego is ever fully absent, because that's a part of who we are. And, just from I grew up, I have a degree in psychology, and not to say that makes me an expert, but I think that just is a part of human beings' nature. However, that said, I think that you absolutely can practice humility to put your ego aside. And that's a big focus, I think, in sort of the Zen leader approach, is focusing on humility. And one of some other pieces of it are, mindful communication. So being really clear about, when you make a decision or you're really solid on something, instead of just saying, no, that's the way it is because I say so, explaining your thought process and explaining the why to people. I think that goes a long way in sort of getting people on board where it's not all about just power and ego. And then being vulnerable, or willing to be vulnerable with people, I think is a big one. It's hard for a lot of people, I think especially men. But in general, it's just a really difficult thing because in the business world, we're afraid to show weakness because we've been conditioned that that is a bad thing. That's going to come back and bite us. But being able to admit mistakes, being able to show when you're having a rough time, when you're unsure, when you show your own humanity, you can inspire trust and respect from other people. And I think that's really huge. Another piece is sticking to your values and your purpose. So that kind of consistency in what you do creates something that people can count on, where they're not. So as opposed to like an ego-based leader, for lack of a better way to put it, that may use fear and intimidation or, just authoritarian methods. I don't know how else to say that. I think that if you create a sort of quiet consistency about how you approach things, people then learn, oh, okay, I know I can count on that. And this is a leader with integrity. This is a leader with values that I recognize. And then last but not least, one of the core tenets of the inner foundation that we work on is practicing a beginner's mindset. And the premise there is that no matter what your experience or your expertise, every person has more to learn, and every person has something to teach. And so when I bring people together, I really like to mix levels of experience because I think that it creates an opportunity for humility to be able to say, oh, I'm willing to learn from someone who's new in the workplace or, has never led in a position of authority before. They might have a perspective that I find really valuable. And so I think setting people up for those kinds of conversations in that kind of learning environment can go a long way towards building respect and trust without having that ego be a big part of it. Quick story. I remember, I think it was in my mid-20s, I took this wilderness first responder course, and I was looking at taking on a company that was an outdoor adventure company. And I was in this class with 20 other people or 15 other people that were all types of expert outdoor adventurers, guides, a couple business owners, climbers, instructors. There was a state trooper in there, people with a lot of credentials in terms of what they were able to do in the outdoors. And one of the gentlemen in there was this guy by the name of Roman Dial, and he is kind of famous here in Alaska. He is a world-class, well-known adventurer. He's done these amazing treks all over the world and expeditions, and he's written books. There was actually, I was at the museum the other day, there's an exhibit about him there at the museum. And he was in my class, and I didn't know who he was at the time, but when I started to learn about him, I was like, oh my gosh, why is he here? He must know all this stuff already.
Right.
But I will say I gained so much respect for him because he was the most humble, gracious person in that class. He never sounded like, oh, I know more than somebody. He was completely open to learning all that he could from everybody around him, who were mostly less experienced than him. And it was just so impressive to me. I've never forgotten that. That I think that's a great example of what a true leader, they let their accomplishments speak for themselves, right?
Right.
They don't have to go out there and rub them in someone's face or brag about them. They have people respect them because they know this is what they've done. But on a human level, they're real, they're down to earth, they're open, they're humble, all of those things.
So what does it mean to lead from being and not doing? It sounds like the gentleman that you're referring to in this group had this down packed.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I think this means it's referring to how you show up, right? So it goes back to presence, being fully present in the day-to-day versus going through the motions and just doing all the things that are on the list, like actually being intentional and present about that. Being, if you think about the word, refers to, like, if you think about how someone is, that refers to adjectives, right? Like, are you being honest? Are you being fair? Are you being trustworthy? Are you being decisive? Whereas doing refers to actions. So like in the work world, running a meeting, giving feedback, coaching an employee, giving a presentation, making a decision, those are all actions. And as leaders, particularly if you have a title as a leader, that's inherently part of leading people. Like, you have to do things, right? But leading from being means you're a leader because of how you do things, not necessarily the things you do. And I think that goes back to your original question of around, like, how can we talk about leadership not from a hierarchical standpoint, but from the standpoint of just being
human.
a leader. Yeah, being human. And so if you're an individual contributor, for example, you can choose to lead based on how you do the things that you do, how you show up in a meeting, how you stand up for your coworkers, how you raise concerns, how you handle problem solving, how you interact with customers, how you manage your emotions in tense situations, and how you give feedback. So these are all things that can be done by anyone, regardless of title. But how you do them and how you show up is what makes you a leader or not.
Let's talk about emotional intelligence and inner work, Cara. How does emotional intelligence begin with self-observation rather than self-control?
Well, I think it's fairly simple. You can't control something that you can't see or that you're not aware of or that you don't understand, right? And so in order to manage emotions, for example, you have to be able to identify them first. And I'll share an example because I think that's a good way to explain this stuff. I remember having an aha moment. I was taking a class this is a while back on emotional intelligence, and it was a really great instructor. There was a lot of discussion and, sort of applying it to your own life. And one of the prompts that we were given was to think about a situation where we had like a disagreement or a conflict with somebody, and to identify in as much detail as possible, like go back to that moment and what were we feeling and what did we really need in that situation. And I think we don't often think about those things, right? Like, we're just in the moment, we're reacting, we're responding, emotions are rising, whatever.
Yes.
And then we were asked to take it a step further and ask the question, what was the other person likely feeling and what did they need? And the situation that came up for me, just because of the timing of it, was a disagreement with my mom. And I won't go into all the details because it's a long story, but we both got really short and impatient with each other. Voices were raised, so on. And when I thought about it, I realized what I was feeling, even though it came out as anger and frustration and irritation, I was feeling an intense sadness and feeling of helplessness because I wanted to be able to do more for her than I could. She's pretty severely disabled. And she was probably feeling scared, frustrated, overwhelmed, and really just needed someone to listen to her and hear her and not necessarily try to solve an unsolvable problem, but be loving and supportive. And so it was so obvious when I actually paused to think about it. But because in the moment, those are really hard feelings to deal with.
Right. And no one's thinking about pausing.
Yeah, no. And it's like, oh, that feeling of helplessness and sadness, like, we don't want to sit in that. That sounds terrible. They're uncomfortable, right? And so it's easier to be short and angry with somebody than to admit those things and to sit in that and to be okay with it. So self-control requires a pause after being triggered in some way to make a conscious decision to act in a way that's different from whatever your automatic response would normally be. And so that takes knowing what that is before you can control it.
And goes back to knowing what your triggers are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. We have a saying, I actually learned this in a nutrition coaching course. Notice it, to name it, to tame it.
Oh, I love that. That is really good.
Yeah.
Notice it, to name it, to tame it. That is really good. Yes, yes. So Zen teaches non-attachment. How can leaders practice this without becoming disengaged? And should leaders be non-attached?
So I think that, this is a really great question. I love this. It gets me thinking really about the relevance of these principles in today's world, right? So non-attachment is actually incredibly relevant in a world where uncertainty is all around us, and the only constant is change. There was a call I was in the other day. They were sharing some research where they talked to all these different, I think it was CHROs, so Chief Human Resources Officers. And the number one thing that everybody mentioned that they were like dealing with was change, like just constant change. And, it's obviously important to set goals and be focused on those goals. But given the changing reality that we all live in, a good leader also has to be willing to pivot and to change the goal when it's appropriate. And so I think non-attachment, it may sound like it doesn't work in the business world, but I actually have reframed that, and I call it adaptive focus, because it really is practicing non-attachment, saying like it's not necessarily about being attached to the way things have always done. So being able to let go of assumptions and practices that may have been in place for decades and, question their validity and effectiveness and relevance. So I think that non-attachment is actually really important for leaders, because we have to be willing to challenge the status quo in order to innovate, in order to change with the times, in order to move forward. So,
what I was thinking when I wrote that question? I was thinking of people, not the systems or the processes.
Okay.
I was thinking of non-attachment to people. But what you are saying makes complete sense. Yes.
Yeah. It's like,
I'm in total agreement. You should not be so attached to systems and processes and to be so rigid in that the company fails because of it. Or the company is hurt because of it.
Yeah. I think, and I think it's actually the opposite of disengagement. It's more like active engagement, right? Because you're engaging in like, what can we do better? What can we change? What can we make? Not change for the sake of change, but how can we do it differently to be more effective? Right. It doesn't mean you don't care what happens. Like, I think people hear non-attachment and they think like, oh, that means you don't care, but it absolutely means you care, but that you can shift and adapt as the circumstances change. And I think it also goes to resilience, because when we're too attached to a particular outcome and it doesn't work out, we can get stuck, right? And it's hard to bounce back and move forward, because if we're too stuck, like focused on that outcome that we wanted to have happen, then it's hard to move on from it. So resilience is about being able to learn from those things that don't work, to learn from mistakes, or to learn from something that's unexpected or even disappointing. And to be able to regroup and move forward. And when it comes to people, I think, it's funny that we had totally different interpretations of that, but I think when it comes to people, you could really use the same explanation, because one of the jobs of a leader is to coach and develop others, right? And I think so often what I've seen happen in the business world is someone gets pigeonholed. So you have an employee that's come in as, say, in an entry-level role, and they get sort of pigeonholed into one career path, but maybe they have all these extra other skills that you don't even know about. And so if you as a leader become attached to saying, I'm going to groom this person for this path, well, I think you're not doing them a service. I think you're doing them a disservice. And so if
Right.
you can learn to sort of be open to guiding them, but not dictating how they're going to be, I think that can be a really helpful way to practice non-attachment when it comes to other people.
Mhm. How can leaders sit in discomfort instead of reacting to it? I know, just a few minutes ago, you spoke about pausing, but that can be really difficult in the moment of the discomfort.
Yeah, it absolutely can. And I think in a long career in human resources and dealing with the fallout of when people don't do that, yes, I concur. It is challenging, but it also can be incredibly powerful when you can learn to do it. So some ways to sit with discomfort, and obviously this, what you choose to do depends on the situation and how quickly you have to respond and all of that. But some different ways that I have used and that I think are really effective. One is journaling. And I know that I feel like some people roll their eyes when they hear that. I'm like, oh, I hate to write, whatever. But I think journaling doesn't have to be like sitting and writing for hours. It can also just be like having a little notepad or a little notebook next to you. And when in the moment you feel like, say you get an email that's really triggering or like a call or something like that, is to just in that moment pause and like write down what it is that's happening. Like, what is it that you're feeling and why? And what do you need? And I think when you can start to like do that objectively, again, you're naming it, it helps you tame it. Like it sounds so stupidly simple, but it really, really works. So if you can actually, and there's something about writing it or verbalizing it, it helps reset our brains. And
It does, because the brain acknowledges it in a different way. Yes.
Yeah. And so that's one method. Some people are so like anti-journaling, so that's not for everybody, but if that's something you're willing to do, it could be really powerful. The other cool thing about that is you can go back and look at trends. So you can see like, oh, okay, this is coming up for me a lot. Maybe I need to do something about that. Or, something unique comes up that you haven't seen before. Another one is talking it out with somebody, like having a discussion with a trusted colleague, a friend, your boss, if you're close enough, and seeing and like sort of checking your reaction. Sometimes getting validation from another person about how you're feeling about it or how you're wanting to respond can be really helpful in sort of working through it. And we say sitting with it. As a quick example, I was on an executive team for a company years ago, and we were hiring for, I think it was like a controller position. It was a high-level finance position. And this person would have to be presenting to our board and, like very much needed an executive presence kind of thing. And one of our candidates, who was, I would say, like on paper, the perfect candidate. She had everything we were looking for. And she was a lovely person, like interviewed well. And all of us, and I say all of us, there was like, okay, I guess it was mainly myself and there's maybe 3 of us on the hiring team, but mostly it was myself and this CFO. And we had this, like, we wouldn't choose her. And I was really uncomfortable with it because it was a bias coming into play. And this woman was very, very large. She was a incredibly, like what you would say, a very obese woman. And as such, and I know this because, it's hard for her to find professional clothes that look nice. And we have also, I think, just an inherent bias against large people. And I was facing this personally, like I was sitting here struggling with it. And I'm like, I know she's the right candidate, but why am I having such a hard time with this? And the CFO I was working with at the time was a great guy. He and I were really close. And so I went and I talked with him about it. And I was like, I just need to call this out. Like, am I off base here? And he's like, no, I'm feeling the same thing. Like, and so we talked through, like, what is it about her appearance that is so troubling? And why are we having a hard time moving forward with her as a candidate? If we do, what are the consequences going to be? Like, we played through all of these things, and it made a really uncomfortable, and I still get a little uncomfortable when I think about it, right? Mm-hmm. But ultimately, in hindsight, we did not do what I would say now is the right thing. We didn't hire her. But being able to talk about it and sift through those difficult feelings that we were feeling made us entirely more aware, first of all, of this bias that was inherent in our process, and also made us a lot more cognizant of some of the reasons that were actually valid for why we didn't want to hire her. And that could sound like making excuses, but we had a really objective conversation about it. And it made us dig into some of the other candidates more thoroughly as well. And so I think sometimes calling out that discomfort, calling yourself out when you see yourself doing something that you're like, I don't know, this is right. Like, mm-hmm. I don't feel good about this. And checking it with somebody else can lead to some really important and interesting conversations. So that is another method. And then it also then signals to other people that you work with that it's normal and okay to have some discomfort and to be open about that. So I think the other thing is giving yourself space and time. And as you mentioned, this is not always possible.
Right, especially in the moment.
Yes, but I think people sometimes think it's not possible when it is. I think it is almost always okay for someone, particularly in a leadership role, to be able to say, I'm sorry, I need to take time out. Can we just pause? I'm getting kind of triggered here. Things are getting kind of heated, or I'm feeling kind of uncomfortable. Can we just take a time out for 5 minutes and come back? Who is going to say no to that?
That's true. That's
right?
True.
But I think we sort of pigeonhole ourselves into like, no, we have to keep going. we have to power through. And yet there's no rule saying you have to.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And that's the first time that I've heard that. And I'm sure it's probably the first time a lot of people in my community who are listening and watching to this podcast right now has heard that in the midst of discomfort or a heated argument, you can actually say, let's take a pause.
Yeah.
You don't have to keep going back and forth and who gets the loudest.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, we give our kids timeouts, right? Like
yes.
I used to, as a parent, give when my kids were little, I used to give myself timeouts. I'm like, no, you guys can play. I'm going to take a timeout.
I have a friend. She did sort of that with her kids when they were little. She would ask her kids, are you ready to talk about this?
Mm-hmm.
Like whatever the subject was.
Yeah.
Especially if it was a subject of contention or, they're going back and forth. And if they would say yes, then they can sit down and have the conversation. But if they said no, she would say, okay, well, how long do you need before we can talk about this conversation?
Yeah.
I was like, and that works? And she was like, it works beautifully.
Yeah. And why not do that with adults? I mean, we all get triggered just the way kids do. I mean, not the same way, right? But like,
take a beat, take a pause, and acknowledge that. Acknowledge that. That was really, really good, Cara. Okay, so how does mindfulness change the way leaders make decisions?
Mindfulness means we get out of autopilot. So I think so many
Do we
decisions.
want to get out of autopilot? Or do we want to just continue on?
Right. Yeah. I mean, sometimes we want to be an autopilot
Yeah.
for efficiency, but I think we make so many decisions every day, right?
Yes.
And we are most of the time on autopilot. And there's a reason for that. Like, you know, we'd have cognitive overload if we had to like stop and think about every single decision that we
Yes.
make. But when you're making important decisions, when you're making decisions that affect a lot of people, I think slowing down, being aware when autopilot is kicking in, and being more intentional about your decision making can absolutely change the way you make decisions. So when you do slow down, I think during that time, taking your, like having, and I don't know if it's a script or a framework or some kind of decision making, like what's the word? I don't know, list of things to consider, right?
Okay.
Other perspectives and alternatives. Have you invited those? Have you made it open for people to question your judgment? Like, have you made it okay? I mean, we're getting into psychological safety a little bit here, but have you invited other people to challenge that decision that you would normally make? And have you looked at or gotten input, if it's appropriate, from all the stakeholders who are going to be affected by whatever decision is being made? And I think that's oftentimes missed, particularly in high level leadership. Mm-hmm. They make decisions about operations, for example, that are going to affect people down a chain of, of processes and things happening. So I used to work in the trucking industry and also in aviation. And in those industries, there's a lot of like, someone does something here and that affects the next person, that affects the next person, that affects the next person. So when you change one thing in that whole chain, there are a lot of times unintended consequences. And so really playing through like, what are the consequences down the chain of events that this decision is going to affect? And then also asking the question, what are the consequences of taking no action? What if we did nothing? Because I think sometimes that's forgotten, that's an option. And being aware of your own biases. So this self-awareness comes back into play, like what biases or assumptions might be coming into play that are creating blind spots for me as a decision maker. And how can I put someone on my team, for example, who doesn't have those blind spots that I can check with? So sometimes it's knowing who to surround yourself with in terms of advisors and decision makers. So I think if you can be aware of all of those things and have sort of a rubric or a process in place when you are making decisions to sort of check yourself, sort of like pilots, right? They have a checklist for everything.
Right. Yes.
I think as leaders, that's not a terrible idea. Particularly if we're making really like big decisions or, directional decisions about what's happening.
How can silence be a powerful leadership tool? I'm reading a book right now, the Let Them Theory. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of this book. And one of the things in the book, she says, silence is a powerful tool because you can never be misquoted.
It's true.
And that really stood out to me. Obviously, I'm still reading the book, but that's one of the things that stuck with me. Yeah.
People are uncomfortable with silence, and they tend to want to fill it.
Right.
And so, of course, it, I think used in the right context,
yes.
Silence can be an invitation for people to speak up, to share perspectives, to expand on an idea, to go deeper. So like when I facilitate courses, for example, I facilitate a class, I will sometimes not, I'll ask a question and just let it sit out there, and people don't respond right away all the time. And it is really hard because I'm a talker. It's really hard not to fill it, but it allows space for people to think and to consider and not feel like, oh, I need to have an answer right away. And not everybody is able to come up with an answer right away. So I think it also creates inclusion for people. And I think in a world of noise and constant stimulation, silence is unexpected. It gets people's attention. So yeah, I think you can say a lot without saying a word.
It's true. It's absolutely true.
And it can give you insight into what people are assuming you think. So if you don't respond and you've said nothing, you'll find sometimes people will assume you're saying something that you're not. And so it can give you some real insight. It's a great way to show you're listening. But this is a cool fact. Silent and listen have the same letters. They're just rearranged.
I don't think I ever knew that.
Yeah. And I have a kind of unique perspective on silence. So my daughter, she's 15 going on 16. But she was diagnosed in 6th grade with selective mutism. And being the daughter of someone who is very outgoing and talkative, we're kind of like opposites in that regard. But the tenet of that condition, it's an anxiety-based disorder where she's essentially like has a phobia of talking in certain situations and with certain people. And so the way that this plays out in a lot of circumstances is like someone will come up to her and say something like, "Hey, how's it going?" And she'll just freeze. Like there's nothing there. She's not making eye contact. It's just like off into space. And people get very uncomfortable with that. She's uncomfortable. I mean, she's in anxiety, obviously, but like, she's not trying to make them uncomfortable.
Right.
But it ends up, they think it's more about, oh, I need to say something now. Oh, I'm doing something wrong. Or, oh, I need, and it's really interesting as an observer to see how people deal with that and how they interact. And when she was younger, when she was, in grade school, the kids loved her. They didn't care. They were like, whatever. Oh,
kids are so awesome.
Yeah. Like they sort of like adopted her as like, oh, that's Kyla. Like and they all like spoke for her. They're like, they sort of like coalesced around her and were like, okay, we're going to take care of her now. And her brother sort of did the same thing. He's a younger brother. And, but as she got older, of course, that became more socially awkward and people are like, what's wrong with you? And, they're made so uncomfortable by it. And so it's given me a whole new perspective on how sometimes not saying anything, because I also look at my own behavior with her when she just doesn't respond to me. And I get desperate and I'm like, okay, I'm just guess what's wrong with you. Like I start offering suggestions and I'm like, what am I doing? Like I can just shut up and let her take her time.
Let her be silent.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think it's been an interesting learning experience for me as a parent, but also as a leader and as an instructor.
Zen emphasizes compassion. How can leaders practice compassion without sacrificing standards? I feel like this is such a big issue. Yeah.
I think this is probably one of the hardest things for me growing up in HR, because, part of the role of a human resources professional is to enforce rules and standards and policies and all of these things, right? But I'm also by nature a very compassionate person. And so I think the first thing to do is to take a look at your standards, at your policies, at your expectations of people, and ask whether they are truly reasonable, fair, and necessary. Because like so many things, I think a lot of companies put policies and practices into place because they think, well, that's what people do. That's how it's supposed to be. We have to have this attendance policy because, well, of course we do. We can't have any exceptions to the rule because then everyone's going to take advantage of us and no one's going to show up to work. That really
It's not true at all.
No. Like, the more you trust people, the more they will rise to that. Like, that's my firm belief. Yes, you have people that take advantage of that, and, we'll weed them out. But like, I think a good practice when you're establishing policies or standards is to role play scenarios and see how comfortable you are applying those standards and practices in each one. The scenarios that are the uncomfortable, sort of like, this person just had a death in the family, or this person is really struggling because they've just been diagnosed with some rare disease, like
Right.
all the things that pull at your heartstrings that you're like, does this policy stand up to this? Right. And what would we do for a person in this scenario so that you don't end up in the situation where you're having to, risk being accused of playing favorites because you're making exceptions left and right.
Right.
And all of that. Or you're risking your policies becoming obsolete because you don't follow them anyway, which is often what happens. So once you've cleaned up those policies and practices, I think you can show compassion by building in some flexibility, empathizing with the person, listening with an open mind. Honestly, sometimes what people need is just someone to listen. I was in a executive HR role for several years at an aviation company, and I had this employee and supervisor in my office alternately every week, like, like complaining about one another. And I was trying to intervene and like coach them through it and all of this stuff. And this employee came to my office one day, and she just was the usual stuff. And I finally said, what is it that you want to have happen?
Oh, that's a great question.
And she just stopped dead in her tracks. And she was like, I don't know. I guess I just want someone to hear me. And I'm like, oh, I can do that.
Yes.
Carry on.
Yes.
And it made things so much easier. And that was the last visit she ever made to my office.
Wow. With that simple question, but it's so important.
Because she hadn't thought about it. She's like, I don't really know that I want anything to happen differently, right? Like, she just needed to vent.
And being heard is powerful too. Everyone wants to be heard.
Yes.
So that was really good and self-aware, as you would say, of her to know that about herself.
Exactly. I also think that, people will try to push limits and boundaries, but upholding them doesn't always mean we're not compassionate. It means we stand by our values. So if you have practices in place that are there for good reason, and you understand that why, I think that can be really powerful. One thing that happened to me early in my career, actually working for Raoul's company, Hawaiian Vacations, back in the day, where I sort of grew up professionally is how I look at it. Like many people in their 20s, I was living paycheck to paycheck. I was trying to pay off credit cards. I was trying to save up to buy a home. I don't recall all the circumstances, but I had mismanaged some of my finances, and I wasn't going to be able to pay a bill before payday, not an unusual circumstance, I think, as people are trying to learn for personal finance. And I asked my employer for a pay advance to cover expenses. There was no emergency. It was just, I had poor planning. And they said no. And I knew we had done it for other people, but they didn't stop there and just say no. My boss explained to me that there had to be a boundary there, because otherwise they would be enabling poor management of your personal funds. And they didn't want the payroll advance to be like an oops safety net, but rather something that was there for true emergencies and unexpected events. So they were a very compassionate employer. But they had limits and they had boundaries, and they stood by them. And despite being like embarrassed and initially upset, I could completely see their point. And it helped me own up to my own role in getting into that situation. and having to be creative and problem solving in a way that didn't involve borrowing from myself in the future. And it was an important lesson that stuck with me. But I think had I been at another employer where they just, that was the, like, they just said, no, like,
Right.
and that was the end of it. I think that would have been taken differently. Right. And so I think you can absolutely uphold your standards and your practices and your boundaries in a healthy way and still show compassion, because that conversation was had in a very empathetic, we understand where you're coming from, but you also have to understand, like, let's look
where
at
we're coming from as well.
Right. Yeah. It goes both ways. And we're really not doing you any favors by giving you that money in advance. Like, we're trying to help you here. Even though it's hard. And it's
even though it doesn't feel like it right now in the moment.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
As we get ready to wrap up here, what is your intention in this space of teaching leaders how to be emotionally intelligent and self-aware?
Yeah. My intention, and I will say I'm a big picture visionary myself. So I want to make the world a better place. And I think we spend so much time at work. We spend so much time in, doing whatever it is that we do to make a living, or, in our careers. I think changing the way that people lead others and manage others, however you want to say that, can be incredibly impactful. Not only to the person who's receiving that leadership, who's being led, but to the person who's leading, because it can make it more fulfilling for them. And I think the way to make the world a better place is one person at a time, to help people thrive. There's some really incredible research. One of the studies is called the Whitehall Studies. And it was done over a long period of time. But anyway, they looked at the correlation between working conditions, all these different factors. But they looked at working conditions, relationship with managers, justice in the workplace, like all these different things, and actual health outcomes. And they found that if you had like an unjust or unfair manager, your risk for cardiac events was 35% higher.
Wow.
And if you had poor leadership, you were 25% more likely to develop metabolic syndrome. They came out with, and this is, you can find some of this too in the Gallup research as well, but they found that having a bad manager was worse for your health than prolonged unemployment. And that's pretty bad for your health.
Wow.
So like, not only, and if you look at my background, I not only have grown up in human resources, but I've worked in worksite wellness. I used to be a massage therapist. So I'm coming at this sort of from a very holistic, thinking about the person as a whole, not only your emotional well-being and your mental well-being, but also your physical well-being. It all ties together. And I think that, just with everything going on in the world today, helping to create more human-centric, compassionate leaders can only be good.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being on my podcast and educating us, and more importantly, telling us about taking a pause during the argument, during the discomfort. Like I said, that's something I've never heard before. So, if the time arises, I will definitely put that into practice. But thank you so much for being on the podcast. You've been amazing.
Thank you so much for having me, Crystal. I've really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. To my community, thank you so much for tuning in and watching. You can get Cara's podcast on YouTube Podcasts as well as Apple Podcasts. And remember, you always have time to listen and learn on the go.